Between 1937 and 1952, a rural convent in western Illinois quietly reported the gradual departure of 20 members. The official explanations varied, some reassigned, others said to have left of their own accord. Yet no public records exist confirming their whereabouts after departure. Local parishioners heard nothing. No family members came forward. What happened inside the walls of the St. Rose of Lima Convent was never explained. St. Rose of Lima Convent was once regarded as a model institution for religious life in the Midwest. Operated by the Benedictine Daughters of St. Isidora, the facility was known for its discipline, order, and a rigorous theological curriculum. Photos from the time depict orderly gardens, young women in white habits, and handwritten ledgers tracking chores and scripture recitation. The convent functioned as both a novitiate and a rest home for elder nuns. By all accounts, it maintained full cooperation with the diocesan authorities. Yet between 1937 and 1952, 20 nuns reportedly left, without any accompanying transfer documents, legal paperwork, or personal correspondence. Chapter 1, Part 1. The institution's reputation. The Benedictine Daughters of St. Isidora began their expansion into the rural areas of Illinois in the early 1910s. Seeking to build a spiritual outpost that could serve both ecclesiastical and community needs, the order acquired a 20-acre parcel outside the town of Winfield in 1911. The land had previously hosted a dairy operation. Construction began within a year. By 1914, the convent was operational, consisting of a main dormitory, chapel, infirmary, garden plots, and a small rectory for visiting priests. St. Rose of Lima was positioned as both a contemplative retreat and a training center. Young postulants arrived from surrounding states to begin years-long religious instruction. Their activities were directed by a formal rule set by the Diocese of Bellamore. Daily routines included hours of silence, assigned tasks, and periods of theological instruction under clerical supervision. Throughout the 1920s, the convent was held up as a benchmark for ecclesiastical efficiency. In 1925, Bishop Michael Orton described it as a clean light for the Midwest, a model of discipline and interior order. The sisters kept detailed ledgers. Records were submitted to the diocesan archivist twice annually. Their choir performed sacred music for the Belmore Cathedral on high feast days. Parish bulletins regularly praised the convent's food drives, sewing projects, and catechism instruction. Internally, the Mother Superior and her council oversaw all operations. Supervision rotated every 6 years. The chapter house elected each leader according to ecclesiastical canon, and the results were sent by mail to the bishop. From 1914 to 1935, there were no contested elections and no major complaints. The leadership during this time emphasized conformity, modesty, and full compliance with diocesan norms. Local residents sometimes interacted with the sisters during charitable events or supply deliveries. By most accounts, they were perceived as reserved but polite. Most interactions took place through the front gate. The public was not permitted beyond the outer corridor, and only clergy had access to the dormitory areas. Occasionally, diocesan inspectors or hospital volunteers would visit, but reports from those inspections offered no indication of irregularities. In 1932, the convent added a novitiate building with room for 16 new members. Enrollment numbers peaked the following year, with 67 women in residence. The community bulletin noted an increase in donations and higher interest in religious vocations, largely attributed to the economic downturn and a surge in public reliance on religious charity. The sisters were photographed delivering food boxes and mending clothing for the poor. A diocesan newsletter praised them for sacrificing worldly comfort to bring spiritual nourishment. Among local clergy, St. Rose held a reputation for punctuality and rigorous discipline. Confession schedules, mass intentions, and feast day observances were documented with precision. The sisters' daily records included weather observations, crop tallies, and entries noting liturgical adjustments. Everything appeared controlled. But archived correspondence from diocesan offices, retrieved decades later during a regional cataloging project, reveals that even in these early years, questions occasionally surfaced. In 1930, a parish priest named Father William Horn submitted a note to the diocese requesting clarification on how the convent managed long-term care for aging sisters. The response from the diocesan secretary affirmed that the convent had a licensed nurse on site and followed all protocols. No inspection followed. That same year, a visitor from the Belmore Office of Religious Formation noted that the novitiate dormitory appeared sparse without adequate heating, though he appended that poverty is part of the religious life. Again, no action was taken. Despite these minor internal questions, no formal complaints were ever lodged. Throughout the 1930s, the convent maintained its positive public image. By 1936, internal restructuring within the Benedictine Daughters of St. Isidora led to a change in administrative assignments. The new Mother Superior, Sister Agnes Mildreth, previously stationed at a retreat house in Indiana, was known for her administrative strictness. Her arrival marked a quiet shift in the convent's tone. Although the transition was reported as smooth, several archived memos from the diocesan office suggest a subtle but noticeable tightening of the convent's internal communication. The convent's annual activity report for 1937, filed in June, listed a sudden reduction in catechism outreach. Where prior years documented consistent weekend travel to nearby parishes, that year's records showed no external visits from January through May. No explanation accompanied the change. The ledger simply indicated internal focus under the community development section. Later that summer, the Winfield parish priest made a request to borrow 4 sisters for a youth retreat. The convent declined. In a letter to the diocese dated August 12th, Sister Agnes stated that internal spiritual inventory was underway and that outside engagement would be limited until further notice. Between 1937 and 1939, 3 sisters were quietly removed from the annual personnel rosters. Their names no longer appeared on internal work charts, meal schedules, or prayer rotation lists. No mention was made of departure, transfer, or release from vows. When the diocesan secretary inquired in early 1939 about the absence of Sister Marion Toll, he received a 2-sentence reply from Sister Agnes indicating the sister had left in accordance with canonical discretion. This pattern repeated in subsequent years. Personnel changes were recorded only in shorthand. Departure forms, previously filed in triplicate with both the diocese and the order's provincial house, were omitted entirely. There was no public announcement, and no entries were made in the Belmore Diocesan Register concerning final assignments or laicization. In 1940, the convent stopped submitting photographs with its annual reports. For nearly 2 decades, a local photographer had been commissioned to take group portraits of the sisters in the courtyard. These images, previously published in religious newsletters, ceased altogether. When asked about the omission, Sister Agnes replied that the community had decided to embrace a more contemplative posture. The convent's self-imposed separation from external communication extended into its correspondence with families. According to archived letters held in the Belmore Diocesan Archive, by 1941 at least 4 families had written requesting updates on their daughters. One letter, dated September 3rd of that year, came from a woman in Iowa seeking confirmation that her niece was still in residence at St. Rose. The convent responded that the individual had departed under peaceful terms, but provided no forwarding information. The diocese did not initiate further inquiry. A memo filed under Diocesan Internal Review Notes simply stated, "Subject to cloister jurisdiction, no interference advised." In 1943, Bishop Orton was replaced following his retirement. His successor, Bishop Lawrence Godden, maintained the general policy of limited oversight for religious orders. When a newly appointed auxiliary bishop raised the issue of incomplete personnel files for the convent, Bishop Godden replied in marginal notes, "Not urgent. Daughters of Isidora have historical compliance." By this point, St. Rose of Lima Convent had reduced its external ministry nearly entirely. The once regular catechism drives, clothing banks, and visiting nurse assignments ceased without explanation. Only basic supply requests continued, usually limited to flour, fabric, and sacramental wine. The convent submitted receipts but little else. An inspection scheduled in 1944 was postponed twice and ultimately cancelled. Diocesan communications cite wartime restrictions and travel limitations. In reality, the convent had begun issuing written statements discouraging unscheduled visits, citing the need for uninterrupted cloister discipline. These requests were granted. No further inspections occurred during the remainder of the 1940s. A former sacristan from the Belmore Cathedral, interviewed decades later as part of a historical documentation effort, recalled that liturgical requests from St. Rose grew unusual during this period. Specifically, they began ordering small quantities of altar linens and devotional booklets more frequently, sometimes sending multiple requests within a month for the same items. He noted that the handwriting on the order slips became inconsistent, as if written by different individuals with no clear pattern. By 1946, total reported residents at the convent had dropped to 42, down from 67 a decade earlier. No official records indicated the departure of 25 individuals. Sister Agnes submitted a statement declaring natural fluctuation of vocation numbers and cited shifting demographics. No demographic analysis was provided. The public was no longer permitted on convent grounds. Even during regional feast day celebrations, the Sisters of St. Rose remained absent. Parishioners began to remark on their absence during events that had historically included their presence. Questions were occasionally raised during parish council meetings, but each time the response was the same. The convent remains in good standing. Despite the reduced visibility, the convent maintained a facade of normal operations through sporadic correspondence. Handwritten notes continued to arrive at the diocesan offices, always polite, always vague. Holiday cards were mailed annually to the bishop's residence, signed collectively by your sisters in prayer. These were kept in the diocesan archives, each with postmarks from the Winfield office. In 1949, the mother house of the Benedictine Daughters of St. Isidora held its centennial convocation in Pennsylvania. Representatives were sent from each provincial house, including St. Rose. However, the convent declined to send delegates. Instead, a typewritten letter from Sister Agnes expressed prayerful support from afar and explained that the sisters were engaged in a period of deep cloister reflection. Internal diocesan memoranda from the time begin to show faint indications of concern. A brief handwritten note dated June 14, 1950, from the diocesan vicar general reads, "We are overdue for formal verification of personnel at St. Rose. There are inconsistencies that require clarification." No follow-up was documented. During a conference of Midwestern religious orders in 1951, a clerical assistant from Belmore quietly inquired whether any transfers from St. Rose had been received by other houses. None had. According to notes taken at that meeting, the assistant described a break in protocol that warrants review. Yet again, no action followed. By the close of 1952, the convent reported only 22 sisters in residence. 20 names previously listed between 1937 and 1951 had disappeared from records without canonical documentation. In official rosters, these omissions were not acknowledged. The absence of transfer paperwork, release forms, or death notices raised no immediate formal inquiry. St. Rose of Lima Convent continued operations into the mid-1950s with reduced staff and minimal diocesan interaction. In annual summaries, Sister Agnes repeatedly cited transitions in vocation fulfillment and the hidden nature of contemplative life as reasons for personnel changes. These phrases were accepted without challenge. It would take another decade before external reviewers were allowed access to the original convent rosters. By then, many of the original administrative personnel had retired or passed away. The gaps in documentation were attributed to wartime disruptions, clerical misfiling, or administrative errors. No disciplinary action was ever taken. The convent's public record remained intact. Ignored signs. In March of 1953, a records assistant at the Diocesan Chancery Building in Belmore found a discrepancy while updating religious personnel files. A routine cross-check revealed that the last known residential documentation for several former Sisters of St. Rose of Lima had no corresponding exit records. These omissions were initially treated as clerical oversights. The assistant, newly hired and unfamiliar with the operational practices of cloistered orders, flagged the issue in a marginal note and forwarded it to the Chancellor. The memo was received and filed with no formal acknowledgement. The incident did not prompt any formal investigation. At the time, diocesan policy held that individual orders were responsible for maintaining internal movement records unless specific allegations or legal obligations required higher review. No such criteria applied in this case. The anomaly remained buried in the archive's lower ledger until a subsequent assistant, nearly a year later, attempted to reconcile it with a request from the Provincial House for updated formation statistics. Around the same time, in June 1953, the archivist from the provincial headquarters began assembling a Jubilee commemorative document to mark the 50th anniversary of the Benedictine Daughters' Midwest expansion. The project required confirmation of enrollment figures from all affiliated institutions. When the St. Rose Convent failed to respond to multiple mailed requests for copies of their updated community chart, a clerical liaison was dispatched to follow up. She arrived at the Winfield property with a pre-written form requesting enrollment numbers, original founding dates, and the names of active and former superiors. According to her report, submitted weeks later to the Provincial Council, she was greeted at the front gate but was not admitted past the entry vestibule. A sister in plain habit, who declined to provide a name, accepted the document and promised it would be completed within a week. No response ever arrived. Follow-up correspondence went unanswered. The matter was recorded as pending internal revision in the Jubilee file. The Council opted not to pursue further contact, citing the convent's long-standing semi-autonomous status. Meanwhile, local indicators of decline began surfacing in Winfield itself. The convent's garden plots, once carefully maintained and visible from the road, appeared untended throughout the summer. Several residents noted that the seasonal deliveries of baked goods and preserved fruits to the local parish, once a yearly tradition, ceased without notice. The parish office received no communication explaining the change. When a lay volunteer from the Altar Guild inquired whether the sisters needed assistance with harvest or transport, her letter was returned unopened. In August 1953, a travelling nurse affiliated with a rural health cooperative stopped by the convent while conducting a routine circuit. She had previously volunteered in the infirmary during the early 1940s and was aware of several elder sisters believed to be in permanent residence. According to her statement filed with the cooperative board, she approached the convent hoping to reconnect with the infirmary director. She was not allowed past the entry gate. A letter later sent to the Diocesan Health Committee described the encounter as unusual in tone and noted that the sister who answered seemed hesitant to acknowledge anyone by name. The board forwarded this observation to the Belmore Diocese with a recommendation for welfare verification. The response from the Chancery Office, signed by an auxiliary bishop, stated that oversight responsibility remains with the order unless state intervention is required. No referral was made. The event was not discussed further. That autumn, a seminarian assigned to catalogue historical clerical correspondence discovered several unopened letters in the diocesan archive basement. Among them were multiple inquiries from relatives of former convent residents, all dating between 1943 and 1951. Each requested confirmation of residency status or forwarding contact information. Some expressed concern after prolonged silence. One letter from 1947 included a return envelope and money order for the sisters' personal use. The funds had never been deposited. The envelopes were sealed and bore postal cancellation marks from their respective towns, but had not been logged as received. The seminarian notified his supervisor, who instructed him to deliver the unopened items to the diocesan secretary for formal archiving. The letters were catalogued without further action. There was no notification to senders. The money order was returned to its issuing bank marked expired. In late 1953, a separate administrative issue inadvertently drew further attention to St. Rose. The Illinois Department of Land and Resource Oversight sent a surveyor to assess groundwater usage permits in the Winfield area. While examining older property filings, he noted that St. Rose of Lima's land use documentation had not been updated since 1935. A letter was sent to the convent requesting confirmation of water source usage and compliance with newly revised agricultural ordinances. The convent responded 3 months later with a brief note signed Senior Miriam, confirming minimal non-commercial usage for resident needs only. The signature did not match any name on file with the diocesan office. The state office did not pursue the mismatch. The note was deemed sufficient for compliance and filed under inactive agricultural holdings. Early in 1954, a rare visitor from the Order's provincial archives arrived in Winfield to verify records as part of an initiative to microfilm old journals and rulebooks. The project, part of a broader clerical documentation effort, involved visiting all Benedictine daughters' facilities to obtain photographic copies of early establishment ledgers. The archivist, Sister Joan Elwell, wrote in her trip report that the sisters at St. Rose declined to participate. They cited an internal policy of document seclusion. Despite polite insistence, she was not permitted to view or transport any archival material. She was offered a typed list of original founding dates, which did not align with previously held records. Discrepancies were noted, but left unresolved. That same spring, an internal review meeting at the provincial headquarters documented rising confusion about how many sisters had actually passed through St. Rose since its founding. Vocation tallies, death notices, and transfer charts from the 1940s no longer aligned with cumulative totals provided in the latest convent submissions. When a council assistant attempted to reconcile the list with baptismal and novitiate entries, she found gaps without explanation. A memorandum was sent to the diocesan chancery inquiring whether any public records or cemetery registries could assist in clarifying the roster. The chancery responded that it held no burial records for St. Rose sisters during the period in question. A follow-up request to local funeral directors and mortuary services returned no files. The regional Catholic cemetery in Belmore confirmed that it had not received any burials from the convent between 1941 and 1951. In mid-1954, a retired cleric living near Winfield submitted a handwritten letter to the diocesan administrative office. The letter, cautious in tone, mentioned that he had once served as confessor to several sisters at St. Rose during the 1930s and had remained in correspondence with one of them until the late 1940s. He wrote that her last letter, received in 1949, mentioned health concerns and a request for transfer to a quieter setting. No further letters came. He inquired whether she had been moved or required pastoral visits. The diocesan office replied that no transfer had been documented. The letter was returned stamped, "No record found." The cleric did not write again. His note was filed under anecdotal correspondence and stored in a cabinet labeled inactive communications. In the summer of 1954, a novice sister stationed at the Benedictine Provincial House was temporarily assigned to assist with filing convent reports from the surrounding institutions. As part of her duties, she handled archive boxes from St. Rose of Lima. The package had arrived weeks late and contained only partial entries for the prior year. Notably absent were any personnel updates or spiritual formation reports, which were customary in every other convent submission. When she inquired whether a follow-up would be requested, the provincial secretary told her, "We've learned to be patient with Winfield." This response, while casually delivered, reflected a broader tolerance that had formed around St. Rose. The convent's quiet withdrawal from ordinary diocesan and provincial oversight had been normalized. It was seen not as a refusal, but as a stylistic peculiarity. "They've always preferred seclusion," the secretary added. No request for resubmission was made. Later that same year, the province received notice that a canonical audit would be conducted across several Midwestern orders. The process was routine, part of a national statistical initiative encouraged by ecclesiastical administration in New York. Each religious house was expected to submit basic demographics, asset declarations, and vocational status updates. Most complied. St. Rose did not. After a second request was mailed by registered courier, a response arrived typed on thin parchment, with uneven margins and several lines redacted in ink. It listed 22 sisters in residence and noted "no changes since previous year." The diocesan secretary flagged the formatting as non-standard, but took no further action. The file was accepted and stored with the rest. Throughout 1955, further instances of omission emerged. The convent declined to send a delegate to the regional retreat for novitiate directors, citing weather considerations despite no inclement weather being reported during the scheduled period. They abstained from submitting a Christmas letter to the bishop's office for the first time in over 2 decades. The absence was noted, but not investigated. At the local level, parishioners continued to observe changes around the convent perimeter. The front hedgerows were no longer trimmed. The gravel path leading to the chapel entrance appeared overgrown. Seasonal delivery drivers from a nearby supplier reported that deliveries were now received without signature. A new practice had emerged, in which the front gate was left open only between the hours of 8 and 8:30 a.m., after which it remained closed for the rest of the day. A regional historian researching monastic gardens made a request in early 1956 to visit the grounds and photograph the convent's original 1915 horticulture layout. He had previously received access to similar facilities in the state and considered the Winfield Convent a significant example due to its pre-war design. His formal request was returned with a note from a sister signing as Senior AM, stating that the community no longer participated in public documentation efforts. No alternative explanation was given. He submitted the note to the Diocesan Historical Office, where it was filed but not acted upon. Around this time, an administrative change occurred at the Belmore Chancery. The retirement of a long-serving auxiliary bishop led to the appointment of a younger cleric with a background in clerical documentation. Upon reviewing diocesan files, he noted that the personnel chart from St. Rose had not been updated in a consistent format since 1947. He sent a brief internal note to the diocesan administrator recommending an informal visit for the purpose of standardization. The recommendation was never scheduled. That spring, a curious entry appeared in the provincial expense ledger. That payment was issued to a local locksmith in Winfield, marked as Gate Repair Convent Perimeter. When the provincial bursar sought clarification, she was told that the front gate had suffered structural corrosion. No invoice was included. The check was cashed by an entity listed only as HR. The provincial council logged the item under minor maintenance and did not inquire further. Simultaneously, the province began preparing for its triennial leadership election. As part of the process, each convent was required to submit a report on current leadership structures and any expected changes. Most houses responded promptly. St. Rose submitted a handwritten page noting that Sister Agnes Mildreth remained in office and that her term had been extended by internal chapter vote. The note included no signatures from additional council members. According to the rules of order, a chapter vote required a minimum of 3 elected council members and diocesan notification. Neither condition was satisfied. Despite this irregularity, the election proceeded without objection. St. Rose was listed as abstaining from council participation. The provincial minutes note that no delegates were sent from Winfield. By the summer of 1956, concerns began circulating in the diocesan office after a statistical report to the National Clergy Directory failed to match local filings. The report showed that the Belmore Diocese had one more active religious house than accounted for in local summaries. After confirming the discrepancy, a clerical assistant realized that St. Rose of Lima had been omitted entirely from the diocesan 1956 roster. The omission was not due to oversight. Instead, the assistant traced the error to a line item marked "No Active Apostolate." Under new national coding guidelines, institutions without public ministries were automatically excluded from public listings unless manually restored. Since the convent had not conducted external ministry for several years, it had been reclassified without review. Once identified, the assistant restored the entry but noted that status remains unclear. That same year, an anonymous letter arrived at the diocesan secretary's office. The letter bore no return address and was written in block capitals on plain stationery. It stated only, "Why are there fewer sisters at St. Rose every year? Why do no names appear in the registers? Does anyone notice?" The letter was logged as miscellaneous correspondence and stored in the general inquiry drawer. It was not followed up. Meanwhile, internally within the Benedictine Daughters provincial circle, discrepancies continued to accumulate. A statistical audit found that total cumulative novices listed between 1935 and 1952 did not align with final profession numbers. At least 12 postulants listed in the provincial entry books had no corresponding records of advancement, transfer, or departure. In each case, the formation house listed was St. Rose. Attempts to locate their files yielded no documentation. The province attributed the issue to wartime disruptions, a common explanation for incomplete archives during the 1940s. A resolution passed stating that unverified vocation transitions during national crisis years shall be presumed reconciled unless contrary evidence emerges. No contrary evidence was sought. By early 1957, it had become widely accepted within clerical administration that St. Rose operated according to its own rhythm. Diocesan and provincial bodies had effectively ceased requesting direct interaction. Reports were submitted infrequently with minimal detail and were accepted without protest. The convent itself remained structurally intact. From the road, its buildings appeared unchanged, though increasingly quiet. No construction had occurred in over a decade. Windows remained shuttered through the winter and unshuttered in spring, in a predictable but impersonal cycle. Parishioners said they rarely saw more than 2 or 3 individuals on the grounds at a time. Yet no formal complaint had ever been lodged. No rule had been broken outright. The convent remained legally in operation, its records sparse but technically sufficient. Its sisters, fewer in number each year, existed only in the ledgers they maintained themselves. By mid-year, the provincial archivist closed the file on St. Rose's Jubilee submission. No updated entries had been received. A short notation was added to the summary page. Convent did not participate. Grounds presumed active. No formal investigation was opened. Truth revealed. In April of 1958, a retired archivist from the Bellamore diocese, engaged in an independent cataloguing project of early religious institutions, submitted a formal request to access the foundational documentation of the St. Rose of Lima convent. The request, addressed to the Benedictine Daughters Provincial Council, was standard in tone and accompanied by a list of historical references he intended to confirm. The council replied within 2 weeks, indicating that all material relating to St. Rose had either been submitted previously or was retained on site in Winfield. The archivist was advised to direct inquiries there. He did so, mailing a duplicate of his original request along with a stamped return envelope. After 4 weeks with no reply, he sent a follow-up, this time enclosing a list of specific documents including the convent's founding charter, early vocation records, and the 1936 personnel roster. The envelope was returned unopened, marked "Return to sender, no authorization." The postmark was from Belmore, not Winfield. Puzzled, he reached out to a former colleague at the Chancery, asking whether St. Rose still maintained clerical access for historical researchers. The colleague responded cautiously, saying he believed contact with the convent had become limited to internal correspondence only. When asked whether the convent's internal archives had ever been fully catalogued by the diocese, he said, "Not to my knowledge." This correspondence caught the attention of a young assistant in the diocesan records office who had recently taken up a side project compiling missing entries from old canonical visitations. Motivated partly by the irregularities in the St. Rose documentation trail, he began reconstructing the convent's reported roster using scattered entries from diocesan bulletins, jubilee announcements, and property declarations. His working draft soon revealed that nearly 20 names ceased appearing in public or private listings after the late 1930s. None had recorded exits, deaths, or transfers. Several of the missing individuals had been novices expected to advance to final vows, but were never listed as having completed formation. Curious, he drafted a letter to the Provincial House requesting permission to view the original novitiate journals from St. Rose, if they existed. The reply came from the provincial archivist, who informed him that St. Rose had opted out of the 1955 Preservation Initiative and had not submitted its volumes for copying. She added that any remaining documents were presumably still in their original location. With no clear administrative avenue remaining, the assistant requested authorization from the diocesan administrator to initiate a clerical welfare verification, a rarely used procedure intended for ensuring the continuity of religious life at registered institutions. The administrator, citing recent protocol changes, declined. The assistant was told that all matters concerning autonomous convents fell outside direct diocesan jurisdiction unless a civil concern arose. Over the next few months, he continued his project informally. Cross-referencing early diocesan ordination programs, he found that several priests assigned as visiting confessors to the convent in the 1940s had made unusual notations in their sacramental logs. A few entries, intended to note the hearing of vows or confessions, instead included blank lines or marginal comments reading, "No record taken," or "Visit not completed." These anomalies were not flagged at the time and had remained buried in personal clerical logs. In July 1958, a new opportunity presented itself. The assistant discovered that the Illinois Department of Religious Property Registration had announced a plan to digitize pre-1950 land use documents. As part of that initiative, copies of convent property maps and building permits were being made available to historians and administrative clerks. He submitted a request for any construction permits filed by St. Rose between 1935 and 1950. The file, when received, revealed a surprising entry. In 1942, a permit had been granted for the construction of a secondary storage annex behind the main chapel building. The blueprint sketch showed a detached structure with two internal compartments, marked only as archive room and utility space. The listed contractor had since retired, but his firm's office had retained carbon copies of the original order. In a preserved invoice, the firm noted that the client had requested reinforced internal doors and non-transparent windows. The note also stated, "Entry restricted during installation. Materials left on site." The assistant included these findings in a memorandum he submitted to the diocesan administrator's office. This time his inquiry was forwarded to the diocesan legal advisor for review. The advisor returned the file with a single typed note. No ecclesiastical violation documented, no further action warranted. In August, a chance meeting between the assistant and a visiting Benedictine historian brought further clarity. The historian, researching historical retreat practices in Midwestern orders, had once visited St. Rose during its early years. He described the facility as strictly ordered, highly formal, and recalled that even then access was limited. When shown the assistant's reconstruction chart of missing names, he pointed out that at least one of the individuals listed had once been assigned to write correspondence for the order's publication. None of her writing had appeared after 1944. With little remaining leverage and no clear path to inquiry, the assistant submitted his full file to the diocesan archive under the title Unverified Personnel Anomalies. He included a summary noting the absence of transfer records, the lack of response from the convent, and the long-term administrative silence surrounding the names in question. That same autumn, an elderly laywoman from Belmore, who had once taught music theory to novitiates at St. Rose during the 1930s, donated her teaching journals to the Diocesan Heritage Project. Among her entries was a list of students she had worked with between 1935 and 1942. Several of the names matched those now absent from all convent records. Her notations included detailed comments about each student's musical progress and social disposition. Her last entry in 1942 simply read, "Class dissolved, no reason given." The journals were scanned and stored in the diocesan digital archive. The assistant annotated the scanned file with a cross-reference to his personnel report, but did not pursue it further. The file was quietly accepted and added to the Heritage Catalogue. No additional diocesan action was taken. In October of 1958, a retired groundskeeper named Edmund Keeley, who had worked part-time on the St. Rose property during the late 1930s, submitted a handwritten statement to the Winfield Historical Society. His submission was part of an oral history initiative, collecting local recollections of institutions active prior to World War II. His account, written on lined stationery and carefully spaced cursive, described routine maintenance tasks performed for the convent, including gravel delivery, gate repairs, and fence reinforcement. Keeley mentioned that while most of his duties were exterior, he had occasionally been permitted to deliver supplies directly to the side entrance of the infirmary wing. He described the building as quiet and orderly, but in his words, not lively. What stood out in his account was a note dated April 1939, in which he recalled being asked to move a series of metal cots from the upper floor of the novitiate to a new wing under construction. He was not told the reason for the relocation. The sister who directed him did not provide her name. Keeley's notes included a simple sketch of the building's layout as he remembered it. He drew a rectangular outline, labeling the original chapel and novitiate wing, and marked the newer addition as Wing B. In his drawing, the new wing did not have exterior access and was only reachable through an internal hallway. He noted that during his later visits, he was no longer allowed near that part of the grounds. The Historical Society filed Keeley's account as anecdotal material, not intended for official review, but a copy eventually reached a regional archivist compiling structural data on religious facilities in rural counties. The archivist compared the sketch to aerial survey maps from 1940 and discovered a discrepancy. The footprint of the building shown in Keeley's drawing included an extension not present in the official tax records. Using county plat maps, he identified a structural addition listed in 1942 under the category Non-Residential Auxiliary Unit. No floor plan was attached to the permit. No post-construction inspection report was filed. When the archivist inquired with the county zoning board, he was told the convent had been granted exemption under a religious occupancy clause. The addition had been approved with minimal documentation. The archivist attempted to contact the convent for clarification. He sent a single-page letter requesting permission to photograph the building's exterior for archival purposes. The letter was returned unopened. A second letter, addressed to the provincial office, was met with a short reply stating that St. Rose remains a functioning cloistered facility not open to public survey. The reply was unsigned. During the winter of that year, a new staff rotation at the provincial headquarters brought a former novitiate director into an administrative role. She had served at St. Rose briefly in the early 1940s before being transferred to another convent in Missouri. When she was shown a copy of the incomplete vocational chart compiled by the Belmore diocesan assistant, she recognized at least 3 names. She recalled them as having entered formation in 1939, but could not confirm their outcomes. She stated that their files were likely kept at St. Rose due to their non-profession. Prompted by these comments, the assistant renewed his efforts. In early 1959, he drafted a formal summary of his findings to date. The document included timelines, name charts, permit discrepancies, and absence of canonical records. It was addressed to the diocesan administrator and marked for internal review only. The administrator acknowledged receipt but did not authorize further steps. He noted in margin script, "No clear avenue for intervention. Order remains compliant by external metrics." The report was archived. That spring, the diocesan press office received an inquiry from a national Catholic journal preparing a feature on long-standing women's religious institutions in the Midwest. The writer asked for background on St. Rose and whether it might be possible to conduct an interview or site visit. The press secretary, unfamiliar with the convent's current status, forwarded the request to the provincial communications officer. The reply was brief. It stated that the convent had declined participation in public history projects at this time and that no photographs or interviews would be granted. The journalist dropped the inquiry. No article was published. In June 1959, a maintenance firm contracted by the Diocese of Belmore to inspect unused properties submitted a routine property adjacency report. The document included site sketches of diocesan parcels near the St. Rose grounds. While the convent itself was not under diocesan ownership, several nearby tracts were. The report noted that one eastern property line, once marked by a stone wall, was now enclosed with chain-link fencing extending beyond the surveyed boundary. The report included a photograph of the fence and its concrete footings. The date stamp indicated that the fencing had been erected within the prior 2 years. When asked whether the convent had applied for any boundary modifications, the local zoning office responded that no recent applications had been received. The matter was categorized as a minor encroachment and logged without follow-up. Meanwhile, within the province, a clerical assistant reviewing outdated internal regulations discovered a clause requiring a triennial certification of life and residence for all professed members. The clause, last revised in the 1920s, had been suspended during wartime and never reinstated. According to the policy, each house was required to submit notarized signatures from all professed members, verifying their presence and canonical status. The assistant raised the matter during a provincial council meeting, suggesting the clause be reinstated in light of recent archival inconsistencies. The council declined to act, stating that present verification standards were sufficient. No certification requests were issued. In late 1959, a researcher from a Jesuit college in Iowa published a brief paper on institutional opacity among cloistered houses. While St. Rose was not mentioned by name, the article alluded to anomalous patterns of administrative silence in certain Illinois convents. The paper was cited once in a diocesan newsletter before being withdrawn from circulation. No official reason was given. In the closing months of the year, a final file was quietly added to the Belmore Diocesan Archive. It included a full name list of the 20 individuals previously documented by the assistant, alongside a table noting their last known function, residence confirmation date, and missing documentation. The file was indexed under a neutral heading. Unverified historical entries 1937-1952. No announcement accompanied its filing. No review was scheduled. Legacy and silence. By the early 1960s, institutional attention to St. Rose of Lima Convent had faded into routine maintenance. The convent remained listed in the diocesan directory, though with no assigned liaison and no formal presence at diocesan assemblies. Its budgetary entries in the provincial financial summary were limited to utilities and seasonal maintenance. No line items referenced outreach, novitiate operations, or external ministries. The structure was categorized simply as a cloistered residence. An independent researcher from Indiana University, preparing a study on archival retention among rural religious institutions, sent survey forms to over 100 properties across Illinois. St. Rose received a form in January 1961. No reply was received. A second form, hand-addressed and marked as academic research, was also ignored. The researcher noted in his final paper that a handful of properties, despite canonical status, operate without external archival participation or transparency. During that same year, a state infrastructure assessment led to the replacement of utility poles along rural roads in Winfield County. An engineering team submitted an application for temporary access along a private lane bordering the convent's north side. As part of the application, a letter was sent to the property, notifying them of potential equipment movement along the easement. The letter was returned with a stamp indicating refusal of delivery. The crew proceeded with the project, and photographs were taken of all bordering structures for documentation. In these photographs, the convent's outbuildings appeared intact but weather-worn. One image, taken inadvertently at dusk, captured the eastern facade of the structure labeled on historical permits as the annex. The photo revealed boarded windows and what appeared to be a padlocked maintenance door. The engineering firm submitted the images as part of a compliance report, which was filed with the county recorder. Months later, while preparing a lecture for a local heritage symposium, a regional archivist accessed the report and recognized the building's outline from earlier land use sketches. He sent a request to the Benedictine Provincial House asking for clarification on the annex's current function. The response was limited to a single sentence. The structure is part of the original property plan and remains unused. Throughout 1962, no significant entries regarding St. Rose appeared in diocesan or provincial publications. The convent's name was excluded from the annual vocation summary. No obituary notices were issued. The provincial newsletter made no mention of its centennial approaching the following year. Privately, several senior members of the Benedictine Daughters' leadership noted the omission, but no action was taken to correct it. A new bishop was appointed to Belmore in 1963. In a gesture of goodwill, he directed his staff to issue a personal letter to each active religious house in the diocese. The letter expressed support for the ongoing work of religious communities and invited a short response describing each house's current spiritual focus. All responded except St. Rose. A third-party courier later confirmed that the convent's mailbox was in place and that delivery was accepted on the same day. The letter was never returned, nor was a reply issued. During an archival internship at the Belmore Diocesan Office that summer, a seminarian revisited the unverified personnel file compiled 5 years earlier. As part of a digitization effort, he scanned each page and created index tags for names, dates, and notations. In reviewing one of the name entries, he recognized a match from an earlier diocesan music award list dated 1938. Curious, he checked local school records and found no subsequent mention of the individual in any public documentation. He consulted with his supervisor, who referred him to the Provincial House for potential assistance in tracking early novitiate participants. The provincial office declined to comment on individuals not listed in current rosters. When asked whether past entries were retained, they stated that old personnel logs were kept confidential and were not open to external review. That fall, a religious historian writing a monograph on closed Catholic institutions visited Winfield to photograph former convent and seminary grounds. He noted that St. Rose remained operational, but observed that no one responded when he rang the gate bell. He left a card with contact information. Weeks later, it was returned by mail with no note, the envelope bearing no sender address. In his book published the following year, he included a brief reference to the convent, describing it as a functioning cloister with no visible apostolic expression. He listed it among 12 properties across the Midwest that maintained canonical status but provided no public engagement. In 1964, a facilities review was conducted by the Provincial Planning Board. While St. Rose was included in the list of active holdings, the review notes acknowledged that its utility reports were outdated. The convent had not submitted a maintenance request in over 6 years. A note in the margin of the report read, "Review not required unless closure is proposed." The review passed without incident. That same year, a diocesan committee on historical preservation hosted a conference panel on lost institutional memory. One presenter cited St. Rose in a slide presentation, describing it as a site with diminishing returns on record continuity. He cited gaps in transfer records, overlapping assignments in the 1940s, and a complete absence of external documentation after 1952. His slide included a visual chart of personnel decay over time, with St. Rose's data represented as a declining curve without terminal points. The presentation drew no formal response. A copy of the slide deck was archived at the Diocesan Documentation Center. No correspondence followed. By 1965, provincial administrative policy had shifted to a leaner organizational model. Convents without active novitiates were no longer required to submit annual programmatic outlines. St. Rose qualified for exemption. From that point forward, its only required submissions were utility reimbursements and property tax coordination. These were filed irregularly. The convent's name continued to appear in the provincial directory, though without personnel listings. Its location remained noted on internal maps, but not on any public site descriptions. A footnote in the updated directory read simply, "Resident status unchanged, no vocational movement reported." In 1966, the Illinois Religious Property Review Board conducted a statistical audit of all tax-exempt holdings within Winfield County. The objective was to confirm continued eligibility under updated legislative requirements. St. Rose of Lima Convent was among the institutions listed for automatic renewal. No recent documentation had been submitted to verify occupancy, but exemption status was granted on the basis of long-standing religious classification. A brief note appended to the audit summary read, "Property unchanged, no activity indicated, no objections filed." The entry was accepted without site inspection. Later that year, a graduate student researching administrative trends in cloistered convents submitted a dissertation proposal involving interviews with retired clergy familiar with isolated religious institutions. Among those he spoke with was a former provincial bursar who had handled annual submissions from St. Rose during the late 1940s. The bursar, retired and residing in a clerical residence in Iowa, described his interactions as minimal and increasingly remote. He recalled a point in the early 1950s when correspondence from the convent stopped, including any mention of individual names. The student asked whether this had been questioned at the time. The bursar replied that it had not. "It was assumed they were following an interior rule we didn't need to understand," he said. "There was always something about them that seemed older than the rest of us. Not behind, just still." The comment was included in an appendix, but not discussed in the body of the dissertation. In 1967, a series of unexpected transitions took place within the Benedictine Daughters provincial administration. 2 senior officers retired in succession, prompting a review of their handwritten ledgers before the appointment of replacements. While reviewing archived correspondence, the incoming archivist discovered a bundle of folded letters from family members dated between 1944 and 1950, all addressed to St. Rose. Each bore notes in pencil such as "No reply required," "Return delayed," or "Forward not possible." None of the senders had received responses. The letters had been retained, not returned. Several included photographs, prayer cards, and enclosed stamps. The archivist, unsure of their intended disposition, filed them under restricted materials and noted the existence of the letters in the updated inventory ledger. No notice was issued to the families. The same year, a diocesan compliance officer reviewing landholdings identified that the water usage reports from the St. Rose property had ceased in 1963. All surrounding institutions had submitted regular meter readings. The convent's line item remained unchanged. Upon inquiry, the county office confirmed that no interruption of service had occurred. When asked about the static readings, a technician from the utility provider replied that the property showed minimal draw, consistent with low occupancy or self-contained systems. No inspection was requested. The property remained classified as active. In 1968, a regional conference of archivists focused on institutional absence as a phenomenon of administrative record-keeping. One panelist referenced St. Rose as an example of what she called incomplete persistence, institutions that continue to exist officially but withdraw from all operational expression. She noted that its presence in rosters functioned more as a reference point than as evidence of activity. The convent, she said, exists without confirming itself. The phrase was picked up by a diocesan clerk who included it in a marginal comment while processing the year's summary of inactive ministries. St. Rose was listed again under "No report received, no report required." The following spring, the province issued new guidelines on property stewardship. Houses with no active formation or apostolic work were to be evaluated every 10 years to determine whether continuation served a communal purpose. A list was assembled of potential closures. St. Rose appeared on the draft, but was removed before final publication. A private note from the provincial secretary stated, "No basis for closure, status ambiguous, location preserved." By 1970, most internal references to St. Rose within the Benedictine Daughters records had adopted a tone of indefinite suspension. It was no longer expected to participate in correspondence. Its absence was not marked. New personnel were rarely informed of its full history. It was referred to only in administrative cross-references and legacy inventories. In January of that year, a researcher from a Catholic Historical Commission reached out to the province requesting access to internal journals from closed novitiates. The request was approved for several sites, but the convent at Winfield was excluded. The response noted that archival material from St. Rose has not been relocated or digitized. When asked whether a site visit might be possible, the archivist stated, "There is no current contact protocol." The exchange was closed. In 1971, a maintenance subcontractor for the province was instructed to review insurance documentation for all fixed properties. Upon visiting the lot adjacent to the St. Rose parcel, he noted in his report that the building remained sealed, the grounds maintained at a minimal level. He wrote, "No movement visible. Entry assumed limited. He took a photograph of the outer gate, which bore a rusted plaque engraved with the original Latin motto of the order. The photo was attached to the report, but not included in the insurance file. A duplicate was later found in a filing envelope labeled "Low Activity Properties, No Risk." That same year, a provincial newsletter published a historical timeline of institutions founded between 1890 and 1950. St. Rose was mentioned only once in a brief entry. Established 1914 Winfield, no active apostolate since mid-century. No photograph accompanied the reference. In early 1972, a visiting Jesuit academic conducting a study on ecclesiastical silence reached out to the Provincial Communications Office requesting context on how some cloisters had transitioned into non-interventionist operations. The office responded with a general note describing the varying rhythms of contemplative life and the occasional disappearance of apostolic footprints due to internal decisions. He was advised that specific case studies were rarely representative. When asked whether St. Rose would qualify as such a case, the reply stated, "No statement can be made regarding the community's present disposition." By mid-1972, the convent at Winfield no longer appeared in printed provincial calendars. Its name remained in internal rosters, but no individual was listed under its personnel column. The entry included no location notes, no contact delegate, and no schedule. It was not marked as closed, it was not marked as active, it remained. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching, and subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering. This story is fictional. All names have been edited to protect the source. This video is for entertainment purposes only. But here's a disclaimer. It's based on historical facts.